Good evening. My name is Mark Mordomi, and I am a member, I am a member of AABA, the Asian American Bar Association of the Greater Bay Area, and your moderator tonight. My day job is with UC Legal, the legal department for the University of California system. I don't need to say anything eloquent tonight to remind everyone how important our panel's topic is. The headlines about the pending demise of Roe versus Wade and today's vote in the Senate says it all. Both Republicans and Democrats agree on at least one thing: elections have consequences. Now, we were slated to have three speakers tonight. Unfortunately, Representative Hong, through her family representative, said that she has a family emergency tonight, so she will not be attending. But I am going to introduce all three speakers because Representative Hong is so amazing. So let me tell you the introduction I was going to give about her. I did not know of her until I was asked to be a moderator for this panel. And though she will not be appearing, I think we need to keep her on our radar screen. Representative Francesca Hong. She is the first Asian American ever elected to the state legislature of the battleground state of Wisconsin. In 2020, the year President Donald Trump lost his election to Joe Biden, Hong won her election with 88% of the votes in the 76th district, which includes the city of Madison. She is a second-generation Wisconsinite, mother, community organizer, and service industry worker. She's a daughter of immigrants who made the journey to the United States in the 1980s. In 2009, Hong decided to pursue her dream to become a full-time professional chef. She started in the dish pit, then worked her way to line cook, sous chef, and then executive chef. Now she is the co-owner of Morris Ramen with her husband Matt Morris in downtown Madison. Hong and her fellow Democrats have been fighting an effort to gerrymander her state's districts. Now, our other speaker who is with us tonight is Lala Wu. She is a co-founder and the executive director of Sister District, which builds enduring progressive power in state legislatures. She is the first woman of color to take the helm of the organization. In her previous role as the director of engagement and partnerships, she successfully led the expansion of the organization's volunteer infrastructure, which now has over 60,000 members and over 170 groups in 32 states. Our last speaker is John Paredes. He's an experienced litigator whose practice focuses on protecting voting rights and free and fair elections, and ensuring accountability for those who perpetuate political violence. He previously served as a law clerk to the Honorable Susan L. Carney of the United States Court of Appeals for the Second District, and the Honorable Lorna G. Schofield of the United States District Court of the Southern District of New York. Before his clerkships, he worked as a litigation associate at Wilmer Hale. And he's up late in New York, joining us here in the Bay Area. Each of our speakers will give remarks for about 10 minutes. Audience members, please go ahead and ask your questions in our chat. We will try to ask some of your questions promptly and save some for the end. And this presentation will be recorded and be placed onto YouTube. So tell your friends about them and have them look at the YouTube after, if they cannot attend tonight or have tickets to the Warriors game tonight. All right, with that, I'd like to turn this panel over to Lala. What are we talking about here? What's within the scope of voting rights and the topic of voting rights?
Thanks, Mark, and thanks to everybody for being here and tuning in. It's great to be part of this timely and important conversation. Before I jump in to talk about voting rights, I'll just give a quick introduction to Sister District as an organization. And what we do is we build progressive power in state legislatures, as Mark said. And we do so because of State legislatures are a really overlooked venue of power, and they are where the rubber hits the road when it comes to policy. Just take a look at the issues of abortion and what we're going to talk about tonight, voting rights. They're also a leadership pipeline for our national leaders, and they are also a place where we can have a really outsized impact. These are small races, and don't receive enough attention, and there is a possibility for folks who may not have tons of time, money to give to really make a difference. So that's just a little bit of background about Sister District. What are we talking about here? We're talking about voting rights. So what does that mean exactly? What's within the scope of voting rights? Well, I think that it makes sense to just back up for a second and remember that our democracy derives its legitimacy from people voting. And it's fundamental to our understanding of government, that this idea that people express themselves and their views through the ballot box. And this is how we elect our lawmakers, our governors, our secretaries of state, our judges, and more. We elect these people who are supposedly supposed to reflect our values and will represent us well in government and make decisions that will impact our everyday lives. So it seems obvious, but it bears repeating, I think, at the top of this conversation, that the right to vote is really central to our system of government. So what exactly do voting rights include? Well, it should be very straightforward. If you're legally allowed to vote, you should be able to register and you should be able to cast your ballot. Unfortunately, voter suppression is a huge barrier to many people and makes it very complicated and difficult for many people to vote. State legislatures are the ones that make the laws that govern voting. And in recent years, unfortunately, there has been a surge in voter suppression laws. So while there are many states and many legislatures that are expanding access to voting, there has been a very serious uptick in voter suppression laws. So the Brennan Center reported as of February of this year that legislators in 27 states have already introduced 250 bills that restrict access to the ballot box. So what kinds of restrictions are we talking about? We're talking about reducing access to mail-in voting, which we are all lucky to have here in California. We're talking about imposing new or stricter voter ID requirements for in-person voting or for registration. Creating barriers for voters with disabilities, not requiring accessibility or preventing a voter who may be unable to cast the ballot and to go to the ballot box, preventing someone from helping them drop their ballot off, eliminating same-day voter registration, introducing burdensome new proof of citizenship requirements. The list goes on. And this is on top of other types of voter suppression that are advanced by election administrators like the Secretary of State. For example, voter purges. So you may be purged from the rolls if you haven't voted for a while without any notice or people telling you. Closing polling places, understaffing polling places so that it may be really hard to reach your polling place, or when you arrive, there are excessively long lines for waiting to cast your vote. And then there's a whole other category as well that I think is important to talk about, which is one of them is gerrymandering. Gerrymandering, of course, is the act of manipulating the redistricting process to draw lines to favor one party or group. And although Democrats do this a little bit, it is by far and away a Republican tactic, and they are masters at it. So basically, by packing Democrats into a few districts and then cracking the Democrats, scattering them among several other districts, making it impossible for them to win those districts where they are scattered, we end up with exceptionally uncompetitive districts where Republicans are in safe seats and they don't need to be accountable to their voters. And we end up with really extreme legislation that is out of touch with what voters want. I think, again, to talk about abortion being timely, most people in this country support abortion. It's well over 2/3, yet we see over and over again, state legislatures passing or introducing these anti-abortion bills because they don't need to be accountable to voters. So it is too bad that Representative Hung isn't here to talk about Wisconsin, because it is such a, I mean, unfortunately, it is ground zero for gerrymandering and its terrible impacts. But I'll just give the example of how gerrymandering is a form of voter suppression, because Wisconsin is truly a purple state. It even leans blue, having elected Democrat Tony Evers to the governorship. But because of gerrymandering, Republicans, although it's really a 50-50 state in terms of the voters, Republicans hold around 62% of their congressional as well as their state house and their state senate legislative seats. So when you vote in a gerrymandered district, your vote really does not mean the same thing as if you were voting in a fair district. So it is also a form of voter suppression. The last thing I'll talk about is, I think, important to discuss, which is election subversion. Election subversion, the Brennan Center defines and has categorized various types of election subversion laws into three categories. One is encouraging sham reviews or so-called audits to detect voter fraud, which is in fact vanishingly rare. Second, legislation to threaten election officials with civil or even criminal penalties, which even for unintended errors, which really has a chilling effect on who is willing to take on these very, very important jobs. And third, enabling partisan actors like the legislature or like the governor to remove election officials from office, presumably because they don't like the result. So the reason I think that this is a form of voter suppression as well is because it fundamentally undermines trust in our elections, which depresses turnout and causes us to have the result of people deciding not to vote. So again, we need more, we should all, as Americans, be encouraging more people to exercise their right to vote. We should be making it easier and not harder for people to vote. Yet, it's almost entirely a Republican effort to suppress votes. And I think that it really is clear that it is just a way for them to try to gain political power. They're really quite shameless in this, and I hope I'm not overstepping my bounds and being overtly partisan here, but it is true. And I think it also is important to mention that these bills disproportionately impact people of color, and that many of the laws that have been introduced and that have been passed, like the massive voter suppression law that was passed in Texas earlier this year, they're not random, or they're not, whatever Republicans sort of have dreamed up the day before. They're taking aim specifically at tactics that have been proven to help turn out voters, particularly voters of color. In Texas, for example, there were lots of drop boxes that were used in the Houston area, and these were taken aim at by the voter suppression bill that was passed earlier this year. So, I find it very cynical, and deeply distressing that Republicans have shown they'll stop at nothing to do this. And, it is really critically important that we focus on and think about voting rights and voting suppression. And, I'll talk more about what we can do about it, but I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ms. Wu. Before we go to Mr. Paredes, I have a question. I was going to ask Representative Hong, but I'm going to throw a curveball at you because I'm dying to ask somebody on this panel. And John, if you can answer this question. Since this is an Asian American Bar Association panel, the question I have is, given our small numbers throughout the country, are Asian American voters even relevant to this discussion and debate on voting rights and gerrymandering, or is this kind of an intellectual discussion among us here?
I'm happy to jump in here really quickly. So in addition to Sister District, I'm on the board of the Asian American Victory Alliance, and I can absolutely say that Asian Americans are critical to voting and to building power in this country. Asian Americans are the fastest growing demographic in this country, and they are making an increasingly important voting bloc. And it is one that Democrats and Republicans both ignore at their peril.
Thank you. All right, John, let me turn the panel discussion over to you. John is the only true litigator among all of us, even if Lala Wong, Lala were among us, she is Lala Hong was with us. She's the professional chef. Lala is the professional organizer, perhaps, or mastermind.
I was a lawyer too. I'm recovering.
Yeah, and you were a lawyer too, but you're not a litigator, right? I'm a lawyer too, but I'm no longer a litigator, and you're the only true practicing litigator among us. So I really would like to hear your comments and thoughts about on this topic.
Well, thank you for the kind words, Mark, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me to speak on this panel on a subject that's near and dear to my heart. I'm honored to be here with you all this evening. I'm John Paredes. I'm a litigator at Protect Democracy, a nonpartisan nonprofit devoted to preventing our democracy from declining into a more authoritarian form of government. Now, I hope you'll excuse just a little bit of personal intro. I grew up in the Philippines in the wake of the Marcos dictatorship. Several of my family members were in the armed resistance. My grandma, my step-grandpa, who got roped into the resistance through their kids, were imprisoned and sentenced to death. And it's only by grace of the 1986 People Power Revolution that they were spared. People Power was the central moral event of my political consciousness growing up. And it taught me what can be required of ordinary people, of all of us, in times of crisis. Now, back to the topic at hand. As Lala has made clear, the freeness and fairness of our elections, the bedrock of our democracy, is under attack in various ways, including gerrymandering, erecting bad faith official barriers to voting, and election subversion. This evening, I'd like to focus on another threat, which is the focus of the work that I do these days. That is voter intimidation, intimidation of election officials, and in general, political violence. At Protect Democracy, we've been concerned with the uptick in election-related violence over the past few years, culminating, of course, in the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. And as the historian of tyranny, Tim Snyder, has said, a failed coup is practice for a successful coup. Currently, we're seeing a rise in intimidation and threats, not just against voters, but against local election officials too. As a recent Brennan Center poll showed, over 75% of more than 600 election officials polled said that threats against election administrators and staff have increased in recent years. And 1 in 5 said that they were somewhat or very unlikely to stay in their jobs through the 2024 election. These are experienced professionals whom we rely on to keep our democracy going. And many of these departing public servants will be replaced by Stop the Steal folks. Now, a large part of the solution to the problem of election violence has to do with law enforcement and state legislation. My organization and others are working on such things, including helping draft legislation and facilitating conversations between law enforcement, election officials, and civil society stakeholders. Now, there also is a role for civil litigation, which is most of what I do. Federal law provides civil causes of action against election-related intimidation and violence. Section 11B of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 makes it illegal to intimidate voters or election officials regardless of intent. Section 2 of the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871 makes it illegal to engage in a conspiracy to injure or intimidate voters, campaigners, or officials in federal elections. And Section 6 of the Klan Act makes it illegal to have knowledge of such a conspiracy and the power to stop it, but negligently fail to do so. Thus, while these tools are far from perfect and far from what I would like, for the right types of cases, civil litigation in federal court allows us to hold people accountable and establish deterrence. Now, this evening, I'd like to share about two related cases I've been spending a lot of time on for more than a year. As you might recall, one of the most egregious acts of election-related violence in the lead up to January 6th was the Trump train highway attack in Texas right before the 2020 election. On October 30th, 2020, a caravan of more than 40 vehicles assaulted the Biden-Harris campaign bus on I-35, apparently trying to stop it or drive it off the road or out of town. They surrounded the bus, forced it to brake rapidly and slow to a crawl, swerved within inches of it, and even slammed into a staffer's car. They later bragged about it on social media and harassed some of the victims online. The people on the bus, my clients, were afraid for their lives. A couple of them were seriously traumatized. The bus driver, Tim Holloway, stopped driving buses for a while because the trauma was too much. And the campaign staffer, David Gins, suffered from panic attacks for months after the incident and was unable to talk about it. Politically, the attack was a huge success. Get out the vote drives were cut short, and the Biden campaign itself canceled the rest of its events in Texas, the largest battleground state. Donald Trump and Marco Rubio publicly celebrated the attack, and some of the organizers of the Trump train attack were later in DC, posing on the Capitol steps on January 6th. Partnering with the Texas Civil Rights Project and Wilkie Farr and Gallagher, Protect Democracy has brought two lawsuits to bring accountability for the Trump train attack. One against the perpetrators and one against one particular jurisdiction where the local police received advance notice but refused to send help. We're suing to get relief for our clients, of course, but also to send a message that political violence is not acceptable in our democracy and that it has consequences. If you engage in voter intimidation or political violence, you will be held accountable under the law. Legally speaking, we're suing under the Klan Act, which, as I said, prohibits private conspiracies to intimidate or harm voters and campaigners in federal elections, and also provides recourse against those who have knowledge of such conspiracies and the power to stop it, but negligently fail to do so. This is exactly the sort of conduct the Klan Act was meant to address, but this time, instead of Klansmen on horseback, it's the Trump train in pickup trucks. The provisions we're suing under have fallen into disuse in recent decades, but they've made a comeback in recent years and months, supported in part by Protect Democracy's work. The civil litigation around January 6th, by the way, which we're also part of, was brought mainly under related provisions of the Klan Act. So as of yet, the courts have not fully made sense of the Klan Act. Section 2 is linguistically a mess. It's a giant run-on sentence, and some courts have gotten it wrong. Now, this case presented a great legal opportunity for us, not only because of the compelling facts, but also because we were able to build an old but good precedent in the Fifth Circuit to survive a motion to dismiss. Having established new pro-democracy Klan Act precedent in Texas, we hope to Xerox that to combat voter intimidation and political violence elsewhere in the country. And with that, I should yield the floor.
Thank you, John. Still waiting for some questions, but I wonder, playing devil's advocate a bit, will your strategy, your litigation strategies, and the precedents they may create, could they backfire and cause restrictions on free speech? Was the bus incident just a college or fraternity prank gone bad? There are protesters at the homes of the Supreme Court justices this week. Could those folks be prosecuted under these laws under the theories that you're propounding?
No. So I just want to make something clear. We support the expressive rights of anyone, including Trump train folks. They had every right, to go to the highway and fly their colors and drive and make their, political beliefs known, make their presence felt. Here, And I do agree that whenever you're dealing with anti-intimidation law, you need to foreground First Amendment considerations. In this case in particular, it's not a close call, right? Because, you may have the right to insult someone, you may have the right to say something politically unpopular. You do not have the right to go up to someone, to go in their face and tell them you're going to beat the crap out of them. In the same way, you do not, while you have the right to fly your colors on the highway, you do not have the right to associate your bumper with someone else's bumper. The right to express yourself ends right before threats. It ends right before assault. And in this case, there were multiple Trump trains that ran before this. We have no objection to it. We support that political expression. But the moment you start to threaten people with injury, you start to threaten them with harm, you don't get First Amendment protection.
Thank you. Thank you. Lala, to push back on you a little bit, I recall studying the Voting Rights Act and, excuse me. Let me ask you another question. So, I had to show my driver's license when I joined the gym, or at least show my utility bill. So when I hear about, voter ID, why not require the same to vote? Since 1965, we've had an African-American president, a Black Asian president. What's the matter with voter ID?
Yes, and I think that it's a good question and that we should consider. But I think that the evidence is really overwhelming that voter ID doesn't make sense as a policy, and it is a form of voter suppression. So, first of all, millions of Americans lack identification. That 11% of citizens, actually, or more than 21 million Americans, don't have government issued photo ID. And this is not just because it's people who want to live in the woods or whatever. There's a lot of different reasons for why people don't have ID. And one of them is that obtaining ID costs money and it costs time. Even if IDs are offered for free, voters need to incur numerous costs like obtaining a birth certificate to apply for an ID. They need to navigate the bureaucracy that is the DMV or wherever you're looking to get your ID. And this is a significant expense, particularly for folks who are lower income. So, this could cost anywhere. They've done studies that average $75 to $175. It may not sound like a lot to you and me, but there are millions, as I said, 21 million Americans for whom this can be a real challenge. So it's also a burden for people who may need to travel. If you have disabilities, needing to get to the places in order to get the ID is a challenge. So many people don't have IDs. It's hard to get IDs. Another thing to consider is that it reduces turnout. And it reduces minority turnout. We want to, as we've discussed, have a world where everybody who's legally able to vote does vote. And in 2014, there was a study that found that strict photo ID laws reduce turnout by 2 to 3 percentage points, which can translate into tens of thousands of votes in a single state, which I can tell you, particularly in these state level or state level races or local races, these races are often decided by a razor thin margin. I mean, just Sister District last year, out of the 12 races we supported, 5 of them were decided by 821 votes or fewer. So it can make a real difference. And also state IDs are really, they're enforced in a discriminatory manner as well. For example, Texas allows concealed weapons, but doesn't, it allows as ID concealed weapons permits, but it doesn't accept student IDs. So this is the kind of thing where you look at it and you say, what are we really trying to accomplish here? And you can see kind of pretty clearly in those kinds of examples, what's the underlying purpose here? Well, the underlying purpose of a voter ID law is to suppress the vote. And that leads me to my last point about this, which is that it's really a problem in search of a solution in search of a problem, because the reason that you would need voter ID is to address fraud, which is, as I said earlier, vanishingly rare. It's exceedingly rare to have cases, credible allegations of fraud, voter impersonation. Unfortunately, there has been a lot of noise about that from Republicans in particular, those who are peddling the big lie. But the truth of the matter remains that it's very rare. So that's the case against voter ID laws.
Thank you. We have a question from Misha Zuckerman, and I'll give our IT person a moment to put it on the screen, and let me read it out. What about the legality of bans on giving food and water to people in line to vote?
Here's the thing: it's not necessarily illegal, but it is clearly voter suppression. And although, and I mean, I think this leads me to talk about something that's very wonky, but this being a legal audience, I think is appropriate. There is a theory called the independent state legislature theory, which is a totally bonkers and fringe conservative theory that says state legislatures have complete control over elections without regard to what the state constitution has to say, what the state courts interpreting the state constitutions have to say, or even, what the voters have to say in terms of a ballot initiative, which might change the constitution. So this would, the legality of bans on giving people food and water in line to vote, or any of these forms of voter suppression that we're talking about, there is, at least in theory, we can challenge them. We can use the Voting Rights Act. We can find state causes of actions to challenge them. But very terrifyingly, the independent state legislature theory is gaining traction among conservatives, and it would create, and if endorsed by the Supreme Court, which also terrifyingly, the Supreme Court justices have indicated that they would like to take this issue up and they would like to rule on it and potentially affirm this theory, we would have a world where state legislatures could enact all kinds of voter suppression laws and nobody could do anything about it. And that is a very scary outcome that unfortunately is a little bit more real than we would like to consider.
Wow. John, you want to say something?
Just very quickly, I am no optimist on the prospects of voting rights in the Supreme Court, but I am still like, I'll be damned if the independent state legislature theory ends up gaining traction on the merits in the court.
Well,
certainly hope it doesn't.
Go ahead, Lola.
Oh, I was just going to say, I certainly hope it doesn't. I mean, I think that what is scary about it is that in the North Carolina redistricting case that went up to the Supreme Court recently, it was a good outcome for the districts in North Carolina. The districts in North Carolina are very fair this year. They're very competitive, and it's a state the sister district is working in, and we're really excited about the opportunities. But in I believe it was, the concurrence, there were several justices that indicated their willingness to take this up, which is truly extraordinary, because if you think about it, I mean, it would be a paradigm shift in how we think about our government.
Absolutely. Thankfully, for now, at least, the court declined to enjoin the map as it is.
Yeah.
So
let me,
John, the short term, we'll see it. Little scary indications for the long term, but yes, good short term result for sure.
John, give us some hope. Let me be pessimistic to tee this up, but why don't you give us give us lawyers hope? Sometimes I wonder. I've done pro bono work early on in my career, and sometimes I wonder: are lawyers even relevant to this discussion debate? The courts are reluctant to change gerrymandered districts as a political question, and maybe the lawsuits don't change the hearts and minds of the voting public. Should progressives be resigned to the possible fact that America is a conservative nation. You've come from a deep background from the Philippines and a history. What can we lawyers do?
Well, I guess first I'm going to make a comment that, institutionally, in my role here for Protect Democracy, I have no position on whether America should be a liberal or conservative nation. I think America ought to be a nation where the will of the people translates into law and policy, and where people get to express that law by voting, by voting freely and having their votes count. I guess one space for hope, in the courts is that, I think for much of the late 20th century, the sort of the aughts, our hope has been in sort of developing constitutional theories to protect substantive rights. And we're seeing a deep retrenchment of that, the end of which, we don't know where it's going to be. One thing that we've seen rise now, in sort of the latest round of voter intimidation litigation is the rise of statutory causes of action. The great thing about these Reconstruction statutes, for example, the Ku Klux Klan Act, is that their text and their original intent were extremely clear, right? Like there's no question that these were passed in Reconstruction, where our country was on the brink of collapse due to civil strife, due to violence, and they not only was the text extremely clear, but they were passed under the extremely broad election power, under Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution, and under the necessary and proper clause. And so I'm at least confident that as some of these statutory questions go up to the higher courts, we have a fighting chance to make good precedent even with their composition today. That is one small piece of the puzzle, but that's a source of optimism for me.
If you haven't read the biography of Ulysses S. Grant, you should pick it up because it has some very amazing stories about what was happening in the Reconstruction era and how awful voter intimidation was during that period. It was in the same areas that we're having voter intimidation now.
A second recommendation, I think is a great book for lawyers, is The Second Founding by Eric Foner. And of course, he wrote the key Reconstruction treatise. It's called Reconstruction. But The Second Founding is a small book, and it focuses a lot on sort of the law that was going on during the time.
Okay, I'll pick it up. Lola, since you used the term wonk, I have a wonky question that I've been dying to ask you. It's about the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which I wrote a paper on in college. It had the pre-clearance requirements by the Justice Department. And I, as a Bay Area person, I noted that Monterey County, just down the road from us, was subject to those pre-clearance requirements. Now, since 1965, we had an African-American president, Kamala Harris, and numerous Latinos elected in Monterey County. So why not make changes to the Voting Rights Act of 1965? It's 63 years old. What's the matter with that?
So we have, in fact, made changes, and in the course of 40 years, there have been many changes, and I think that what you are getting at specifically is what happened in Shelby. So Shelby versus Holder was a Supreme Court case that addressed the legality, the constitutionality of Section 5, which is the pre-clearance provision of the Voting Rights Act. So let's just back up for a quick second. I think this dovetails nicely with the conversation we were just having about Reconstruction and the Jim Crow era. The Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965 to ensure that local and state governments don't pass laws or policies that deny people the equal right to vote based on race specifically. And, the context is that this was in an era trying to address Jim Crow laws that were on the books, that were, by the way, not federal policies. They were state by state policies. So, this is going to be a running theme in everything that I say, but all of this action is happening at the state level. And so, Jim Crow was a constellation of voter suppression laws that were passed by individual states. And the Voting Rights Act was passed because the federal government and we simply couldn't trust some of these states to do their job, right? Which was to give people equal access to the ballot. And so there were all kinds of wild restrictions on the books, like literacy requirements or financial requirements, landholding requirements, et cetera, et cetera. And they were all nefarious. They were to prevent Black people from voting. So Section 5 was really critical for requiring that certain jurisdictions with a history of discrimination based on a formula submit any proposed changes to the Department of Justice, the Federal Department of Justice, for pre-clearance. Basically, if you're going to make a change to voting laws in your state and you have a history of discrimination, you need to let the federal government know so they can take a look and approve it. But then in June 2013, the Supreme Court did away with this entirely. And they said that it was unconstitutional, this Section 5, because it was old, basically. And they said, well, Congress, if you want to do something about it, feel free. That's great. Obviously, that was not forthcoming because although Obama was in power, Republicans had taken over state legislatures in 2010 in a plan called Red Map, and they were able to gerrymander their way into into a majority in Congress. So it all relates. It all comes back together. So in the absence of Congress revisiting what this formula looks like to determine discrimination, in practice, it means that communities who are facing these new discriminatory challenges need to file suits themselves or wait for the DOJ to file them. And that's not very effective, particularly when you consider the fact that elections still happen every year, regardless of whatever's happening with this litigation. And so the whole point of pre-clearance was to address these issues in advance so that people could vote in every election. So, Chief Justice Roberts' majority was really premised on the idea that racial disparities no longer exist. I think that I hope that we can agree here that this is patently false. I mean, a recent, I think this was also from the Brennan Center, I saw that 71%, I think in 2020 elections, basically 71% of white voters cast their ballot, but only 58% of non-white voters did. And so there's ample evidence it's not because, or it's not exclusively because, non-white voters don't want to vote. It's because of voter suppression of all the kinds, voter intimidation, everything that we've been talking about. It's language access, it's polling locations, it's inability to vote by mail, it's confusing requirements, long lines, the list goes on and on and on. So, basically what Justice Roberts said was, it works so well that we don't need Section 5 anymore. But as Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote in her dissent, the logic was really flawed. She said it's like throwing away your umbrella during a rainstorm because you're not getting wet, right? Because oh, well, this has worked so well. This is great. We're all set. No more Section 5, no more pre-clearance, no more watchdogs over these states which have a history of discrimination. And I think, look, the proof is in the pudding. Shelby was decided in 2013. Since then, as I mentioned at the top, we've seen a proliferation of voter suppression laws, including the recent spike that I talked about. So, they said and that things were all good and everything was copacetic, but I think that in the years that have passed, it's been clear that's not the case. Oh, you're muted. I think you're muted, Mark.
Thank you for satisfying that curiosity I've had since
Sure.
2013.
And thanks for raising the question and for your thesis in college.
So let's see now. I'm going to ask kind of maybe a closing questions. We haven't had any more questions from the audience. You know, this is an event by the Asian American Bar Association of the Greater Bay Area. And we are sitting here somewhat content, always glad that we're not in one of these districts, in these states where we have to, that giving water while standing in line for voting is illegal. Although there is probably gerrymandering going on, we have a district drawing commission that are not politicians that draw the districts. So an effort to target gerrymandering. The horror stories about people threatening local election officials have not been as rampant here in the Bay Area or in California, but we do have election officials here, right? And we have contested elections and school board elections, etc. So, maybe we're just fat and happy here in California. What should we be doing here locally, or what should we be doing if we're interested in the issues that each of you are working on to address these very important issues?
I can start. I've got a great answer for you. It's to check out Sister District. Sister District is designed to channel energy from deeply blue places like California here in the Bay Area and to direct them to where they're really needed. And so we do a variety of things to build power in state legislatures, but the thing we're most well known for is our grassroots field and fundraising program, where we harness this energy and organize folks into teams wherever they live. And then they are sistered up like a sister cities concept with 2 to 4 state legislative candidates per year for support. And then the volunteers in these chapters will raise money to go straight to state legislative candidates in close races in key states. We'll also make phone calls, write postcards, hopefully this year, pandemic permitting, travel, go knock on doors. And, as you said at the top, Mark, elections have consequences, right? And we would not be in as big of a mess as we are in now if we had been keeping up with the Republicans in terms of their very deliberate and long-term strategy to consolidate power at the state and local level. So Democrats are targeted the party, but there is work that we can do. And Sister District has chosen races that are close, winnable, and that your help can actually make a difference. And in these key states that not only have great state legislative electoral opportunities, but also have great congressional, Senate, governor's races, secretaries of state races as well that are really key. And so anybody who is we turn out at the state ledge level, they're going to vote all the way up the ticket. And that's what we kind of call reverse coattails. So check out Sister District. I think it's a great way to channel your anger, frustration about voting rights, about abortion, about you name the issue. It all happens at the state level.
Thank you. That all makes a lot of sense. There's a nation in the world that I think, one party controls every level of government. And I think that's the case in Russia, from the school district all the way to the presidency. And we all know how that's turning out. We have one question, but John, why don't you answer the question I raised, and then we can go to that last question from the audience.
Yeah, I'm just going to add local election officials, some of whom in California, but elsewhere in the country, have been under an immense amount of strain in the past few years and are largely unappreciated and feel like they are working alone and without support. And so I would say, to the extent that you can show support for election officials, show appreciation, show them that that we care about them and that we do see them as sort of crucial servants of our democracy, we should do that. To the extent that people want to work the polls, to the extent that people of goodwill want to be election officials, they should consider looking into that.
Poll workers, you mean?
Yeah, poll workers, or like, actual sort of people, with administrative positions. And then, there is for lawyers, there is a lawyer network called the Election Official Legal Defense Network that people can connect with, that provides representation for election officials who are subject to harassment or malicious prosecution, and whatnot. So those are just a few ideas.
Can you give that name again in case people
Yes.
don't want to see it replayed on YouTube?
It is the Election Official Legal Defense Network. I don't know how to pronounce the acronym, EOLDN.
I think election official defense is probably easier to remember. We have one more question from the audience, and maybe we can just wrap it up after then, although I'm welcoming, we have 10 minutes, so I'm welcoming any other questions, but you can see it on your screen. As far as recent SCOTUS jurisprudence goes, is there any justification for all this besides partisan advantage?
I'm happy to jump in. No. I mean, of course, there's many legal arguments. That's what the subject of the briefs and the oral arguments, and that's why it's at the Supreme Court, is because there are legal arguments that are being made. But a lot of it is just under I think that the quiet part is often quiet, but is increasingly even said out loud, and the fact of the matter is that these types of laws and these fringe theories, they're all being advanced because they conveniently are and strategically advance and help to grow Republican political power. And that is something that maybe we, with our fancy educations and with this idea that everything has both sides and so on, it maybe doesn't sound quite right. But the thing is, Republicans don't care. Republicans are ruthlessly strategic, and they are the fact is, we want power and we're going to get it no matter what. And the litigation is just one avenue, but there are many others as well, and that involves it's a top to bottom infrastructure for them, right? Federalist Society gets judges appointed. They have been building state power for a long time. They're also going after state Supreme Court judges who are elected in many states, and that's going to be really critical as well. It's all part of it's a very well constructed apparatus that the Republicans have for consolidating power, and it's all part of it. So not to be conspiratorial, I mean, there are sometimes, of course, arguments to be made, but I mean, what's the motivating factor? Why are these things being brought? I mean, I think that it's for partisan gain.
So
go ahead, John.
I'm going to maybe give a little bit of a squirrely lawyer preamble to my answer to this question. And it's similar to what Lala said, which is that, of course, there are justifications, right? It's not like these briefs don't have arguments in them, and, they're not stupid. With regard to sort of some of the voting rights precedent, of the past several years, I will say that there are justifications, but I wonder how many of them are pretextual. And one thing that that sort of runs through this jurisprudence is just sort of a willingness to lean on legal formalism and ignore social fact, ignore realities in the world, and rely on sort of pure theory to come to some outcome that happens to be politically convenient. And, in my view, that's not how judges should be deciding hard legal questions.
I second everything he just said.
But as litigators, don't litigators, try to come up with as many theories as they can and pitch them to the court and argue the best? Isn't that what litigator? That's the job of a litigator, isn't it?
Well, that's the job of a litigator. But I mean, there are reasons people are litigators, right? Like, I could be a hired gun, to support whatever cause. I am not in this job that I'm in just for the thrill of litigation. I'm here because I believe that certain causes need the best representation in court. Now, the role of a litigator is completely different from the role of the judge. The reason why we give litigators license to argue whatever they can and see what sticks to the wall is because we have the idea of a judge, who is a wise, accomplished lawyer, human being who looks at the situation as a whole, who is aware of social facts, and who decides cases according to the law, and where the law can go one way or another, aware of the social situation and the potential impact of a judicial decision.
Right. Great. Makes sense. All right. I just had to move around because my laptop was running out of power, but I'm plugged in now. I don't see any more questions from the audience. Why don't we begin to wrap up? I yield the floor to both of you if you have any additional closing remarks. I tried to wrap it up with an earlier question, but if you want to add 2 more cents, you have the time.
Sure. Just thank you so much for having this conversation and for inviting us to be in conversation with each other. I learned a lot. I hope that everybody here did as well. And just a final plug to check out Sister District. And also just a plug also that you're all lawyers, you're very busy. And if you don't have time to volunteer, giving money is a form of activism. And so, don't feel guilty about that or something. Like, giving money is really a way that you can help to get the change that we want to see. So there's lots of different places, lots of different worthy causes to give, but come check out Sister District, our candidates, and our organization. And I'm just grateful to be here. Thanks.
John?
Similarly, so grateful to be here. Thank you to Mark, you, Lala, and everyone. I learned a lot as well. Of course, I have to plug Protect Democracy. I will say, check us out. We do a lot of work, not just in voter intimidation and political violence. And lastly, if anyone hears about any bad instances of voter intimidation of election officials, or political violence in general, please reach out to us because we'd like to do something about it.
Fantastic. Well, on behalf of AABA, I want to thank both of you for a truly enlightening panel. I learned a lot. I've studied this issue since my paper in college, and I learned an awful lot, and I am inspired as to what we can do locally. So thank you very much. And John, I mentioned this in our pre-meeting, but please make sure you check in with us the next time you're in the Bay Area. We would all love to meet you in person and hear more about your work.
Oh, twist my arm. How dreadful to have to come to visit San Francisco.
Or with that, I'll close this program and wish everyone a good rest of the week.
Thank you.
Thanks.